You'll not be at all surprised that it's because people like you, who are spending a lot of time and energy in developing markets, we've seen a very dramatic increase in foreign direct investment going to the emerging markets over the last 20 years, really. Huge boom post-1995. And despite the drop after the dot-com bust and a lot of the things that were happening worldwide, a real pickup again in the last several years. Two main drivers behind this is the actual liberalization of foreign direct investment regulations, which limited a lot of foreign direct investment into many of these markets in the past, and in many cases, just improvements in telecommunications, power, infrastructure, otherwise, that have made some of these investments attractive now when they were not attractive before. So we decided from the McKinsey Global Institute side to try to find out what's behind all this, what's really happening, what does this mean in terms of the activities the multinational companies are taking on, what does it mean in terms of the impact on the host economies, output, employment, productivity, prices, product selection, et cetera, and that's what I'll share with you today. Just a range of the case studies that we conducted in order to inform those questions. We did a total of 14 case studies. You'll see that they span a wide variety of industries, from hardcore manufacturing, auto, to softer consumer electronics, to some of the services, not just the lots of body services like retail and banking, but also the IT services and business process operations, particularly in Indian phenomenon. We looked at 4 major markets. They're all very large developing markets, but you'll appreciate that they have a wide variety of approaches to regulation and macroeconomic conditions. And with all of this, we thought we would be able to develop the granular perspectives that would allow the kind of pattern recognition that we seek. Now, to interpret what we learned from these case studies, I'm going to elevate you up to the bird's eye view for a minute to say, what is it the companies are doing? If we were trying to explain from one level above the process that companies are going through and what's really happening as they enter these markets, we would do so across all these sectors and a lot of other work we've done at McKinsey, and describe it as a process that fits neatly into 5 stages of increasing global economic integration, increasing sophistication in the way you think about how companies are integrating things globally. Not necessarily sequential. Companies can jump around these, but these do speak to higher degrees of sophistication, higher degrees of global economic integration. So I'm going to tell you what these 5 are and then just spend a minute on each of them using our case studies and our sectors to explain what we mean by these. In the first instance, simplest form is a company takes its operations just as it developed them in its home country and puts them into the new market. This way achieving new customer segments, opening markets, but it's just a replication of the business model into these new markets. Second one, you have that, but with, at the company level, specialization by product. And so you see an entire value chain being put in one location, but a different value chain or different product or service or other capability in a different country, and using trade as a way to optimize the production platform, so to speak. The third stage is a little more interesting, and it's a little more new, where you see companies disaggregating the value chains, taking pieces of the value chain from beginning to end and putting them in locations according to the specialization of those locations. That could be low-cost labor in many cases. In other cases, it could be specialized skills or otherwise. And we've begun to see that a lot more, not just in the context of developing country FDI, but just broadly. The fourth and fifth stages are really the things that in our mind make for a much more interesting and very new dynamic, and it really stems from the integration of large economies like China and India into value chains. And the fourth stage we'd characterized as having disaggregated pieces of the value chain, taking those pieces and reconsidering how those are done to take advantage of very different locations. As I said, I'll come back to this in a minute, but it's something that we're beginning to see much more taking place in China and India than not seen much of it before that. Fifth stage is where you do see companies taking advantage of specialization in multiple markets, of the specific advantage of those locations, you can see very radical shifts in the cost of delivering those products, in the production function of delivering those products, and the result is whole new markets become viable. So let me spend a little bit of time on each of these and bring them to life with the sector cases. First one, new market entry. Straightforward stuff. This has been going on for decades, but examples that we looked at here were particularly in retail, where you have opening of FDI in Brazil, in other places, and you have the replication of the entire business system in those markets. Second stage, again, it's been around for a while, but it's worth noting the process by which companies take, for example, the auto manufacturers began to specialize the products into different markets. So you had the lower value added products being done, not just assembly, but across the chain initially in markets like Mexico, the higher value added products in the US, and using the trade agreements in effect to trade. The effect here was pretty dramatic when you look at it from a productivity point of view. What you saw were much, much higher capacity utilizations in the plants, because you didn't need the switching, you didn't need the tailoring to the markets, and very dramatic increases in productivity. Now we switch to the third stage. Now in the third stage we have the disaggregated value chain. Probably the best example is what we see happening in the PC world, across consumer electronics really, but our PCs are among the best examples. Dozens and dozens of countries represented through different component parts, where the cost is competed, and therefore you get real pockets of specialization with pieces of the value chain in effect dispersed, assembly in a final location, typically very close to the consumer. Finally, within this, of course, the most recently debated and feared aspect of disaggregation is what we've been seeing happening in the services sector with offshoring of services. And this, as you can see from the various locations that we've looked into it, is a very large market. India is already 12 billion, Ireland 8, and all growing very, very rapidly. Now we move into the fourth and fifth stages quickly. I'm going to use an example from services, but the dynamic you can see elsewhere. The first half of this waterfall chart is the level of savings that are possible by migrating a task from a developed world location to a developing world location, in this case to India, but the example holds in many cases. And most of this you can really describe as a task migration. You're taking what was done somewhere before, the way it was done before, and you're just taking advantage of lower cost labor. The next phase of this, in effect, really speaks to taking advantage of a very different dimension of those markets. Consider this. In a developed world context, the operating cost structure in most companies is 70% labor, 30% capital. Now you jump to a developing world context, the operating cost structure is the inverse. It's typically 70% capital, 30% labor. However, all the processes that were created and fine-tuned in a developed world context were all around optimizing labor, around labor productivity. Makes a lot of sense because that's where your cost bulk is. And yet, as you migrate into a developing world context, from a company point of view, the opportunities to more intensely use your capital, which is the scarcer, the most expensive one, even at the expense of labor productivity, is pretty high. And we've seen examples where companies are achieving an incremental 30 to 40% off the original cost base by taking advantage of these very different capital to labor trade-offs. Two clear examples to bring it to life that most of us are familiar with: 24/7 operations, call center operations in India. Not viable in a developed world context. Why? Because the labor cost component is just too high to make that a viable concept. In the Indian concept, what is really constrained and expensive is the computer, the telecommunications equipment, the online connection, and maintaining that fully utilized as much as possible, even at the expense of labor productivity, is actually a very cost-efficient thing to do. There are all kinds of examples that we picked up across the sectors of this, although in our view, companies are just beginning to understand that. India automotive with smart automation would be another good example, which I can come back to if you're interested. Lastly, as you all know, when you achieve such dramatic different cost production positions, you shift dramatically on the demand curve. And that is, in effect, what we see happening. And it's everything from the $4,000 car that the India automotive companies are now creating for the India market, whereas before the lowest endpoint was closer to $10,000, to microsegments of the developed world that before weren't scale enough to develop products for, but at these cost points are sufficient scale, even if they're not big enough. And again, we see pretty important examples of this in consumer electronics, in automotive, more and more, and of course across all the services dimension of business process and IT. So this is the bird's eye view of what's happening at the company level, and in effect, in our view, why the very dramatic increases that we've been seeing in FDI are still relatively nascent. We would expect much, much more, because the opportunities for value creation from a company level view of these kinds of stages of economic integration, of integrating China and India into value chains, are enormous. We went through a detailed case study of the auto sector and concluded that the saving opportunities for the auto sector are very large, that the revenue potential because of this dynamic is even larger, and the result of those together is an increase in the revenue pool, if you want, of nearly 30% of the current auto sector revenues. So very significant and will continue, in our view. But what does this all mean for the developing countries? This is what's happening to companies. This is the sector case studies helped inform this. In truth, the results were pretty unequivocal. When you look across all 14 case studies, what we found is in 13 out of the 14 case studies, the impact was either positive or very positive in terms of output, productivity, employment, product, quality, and cost. We had one neutral example, which I'll come back to later. And most of the lower end of this was really in banking, which is explained by the relatively lower levels of competitive intensity in banking. But this is just a moment to pause, and I hope you can figure out the various symbols here for the different sectors. But the top line is 13 out of 14 case studies. The net result was positive. Now, how do we sort of measure those? And you will, if you have interest, can go back to the detailed case studies. But at the highest level, we have the impact is mostly felt on the consumer. It's the consumer in these emerging markets that sees much, much lower prices, much higher quality, much better production or choice, in effect, and the much feared impact of FDI in these markets, i.e. on employment, in restructuring existing incumbents, we found to be an issue, but there, 2/3 out of all the cases had either positive or neutral impact on employment. In the third of cases that saw negative impact on employment, we could trace that back to very bloated existing companies, mostly state-owned enterprises, some quasi-monopoly that happened to be in the private sector, and arguably necessary to have that disruption in order to achieve the productivity gains. Very important as we look at the details of the sector cases, a segmentation on the motivation of FDI seems to have a significant impact on how you understand the impact on the host economy. And so we saw that companies that were looking for lower cost labor, basically, that were efficiency-seeking companies, were all net positive contributors to the host economy. You saw dramatic increases in output, typically and often in sectors that didn't exist at all. Employment, obviously, productivity, because best practice was being transferred immediately. And because these were focused on the export market and therefore not really in what was happening to the dynamics of the economy at home, you didn't really see a lot of the downsides that sometimes are felt by those in the markets themselves. By the same token, you didn't see the same level of benefit to the consumer, because these were really benefiting global consumers, not necessarily the local consumers. In several instances, we did see that impact on the local consumer as well. So we had the automakers in Mexico, in effect, disseminating financing of auto loans where they hadn't existed before, even though most of the market was export-oriented. So there were instances of that, but by and large, it was purely positive impact on output, productivity, employment, without any of the falling out. No surprise, this is what most developing countries try to focus on, is attracting FDI that is export-oriented in nature. On the other motivation for foreign direct investment, which is really seeking markets, entering those markets in order to serve the customers in those markets, we saw equally powerful impact. But here the story is more nuanced. You had very large impact on productivity across the board, significant impact on output, sometimes negative impact on employment, as I said before, as you'd expect. And in effect, the cost to the incumbent companies, either the oligopolistic, in many cases, owners, or the labor that was in those companies, created a lot of the backlash to FDI that you hear about often. Now, interestingly, some of the market-seeking FDI that goes in is what we describe as tariff jumping. There are tariffs that don't allow FDI to come in, and so companies that would normally serve those markets by exporting into them will set up operations in order to serve them. In those cases, we saw the same kind of benefits across the board and a lot of impact on the incumbent companies, which has a very positive productivity effect, even if it creates a lot of dislocation. Now, when we reflect on the benefits that we saw across the board, we concluded that although overall you had so much gain, the policies in place that are prevalent in a lot of these countries suggest there's actually room for much, much greater impact positive impact from foreign direct investment. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that didn't work and why they didn't work, and some of the things that did work and why we saw them working. Many countries have a wide variety of incentives to FDI of one form or another, either direct incentives, cash, land, tax subsidies, tax breaks of all sorts. They put import barriers precisely in order to try to attract companies to come in and enter. And they often have other mechanisms like local content requirements or other things which are non-trade mechanisms, but non-trade limiting mechanisms that have the same effect of trying to create investment locally from foreigners to fuel domestic employment. Now, in our case studies, what we learned is that the impact of all these tools that many of these countries use is at worst ineffective, at best ineffective, in many cases very detrimental. And it's detrimental not only because it has a direct cost, whether it's the direct grant or the administrative costs associated with those grants, but very importantly because of the distortive effects that it creates in the economy. And by and large, we could not find a single example where these had the desired effect. Even where you had the ability, you attracted the investment, you created all kinds of negative productivity outcomes. So let me give you an example of that. Brazil, auto sector. After the opening up of FDI, the Brazilian government, as by the way many state governments in the U.S., went into a feeding frenzy to try and attract the OEMs into their marketplace. And they succeeded. They managed to get a lot of investment in. But the level of investment that was attracted was orders of magnitude higher than any reasonable market forecast would suggest. It's amazing what you can justify when you have subsidies to the tune of $180,000 per job created. That's the level of incentives that the Brazilian government ended up handing over to the OEMs, in effect, to the manufacturers of assembly. Result was at least 40% increased capacity over and above what was required, and the expected downward effect on productivity. Now, if those targeted policies towards FDI don't work, what? Yes?
Sorry, good question. You mentioned a subsidy. Subsidy on what?
Well, there are different forms of subsidies, but we've seen subsidies in the form of tax breaks, so that companies get a tax holiday for a period of time, which is a form of subsidy. There are direct subsidies whereby the government will give a company a land grant or a literally cash out of hand. In the case of the Brazilian OEMs, it was in many cases literally a check of money back to the company to locate in one location versus another. And I would point out that some of this bidding war, which we see unfortunately in the U.S. too for plants trying to operate, has two levels. It's bad enough that the federal governments do this in the sense as money's coming in, but in effect what often happens is that the states or one level below the federal government compete with each other to try and attract this, and in fact bid away an enormous amount of value. What does work based on these experiences? Well, a couple of obvious things. I'll pick up the first and the top and the bottom because they're pretty straightforward. Macroeconomic stability is very essential. Think about Brazil before the stabilization of the real. It's not possible to even get FDI attracted in there, but it really is a precondition to the level of FDI that we see, or the growth going forward. And the bottom one is the importance of infrastructure. And through many of the surveys that we did with executives on the ground, while they were actively negotiating the various subsidies and other incentives that they were being offered, they all said, 85% of them said, not all, 85% of them said, we would frankly prefer to have that level of investment put into the infrastructure. And this is particularly true in sort of the newest kinds of investments, the India IT and BPO operations and otherwise, than get them directly in subsidies, because in the long run that's just much more valuable to us. So those are pretty obvious. The ones that may be a little less obvious, and this gets to some of our punchlines on the FDI, is the degree to which ensuring, in addition to allowing the FDI to come in, that FDI contributes to the competitive environment in a meaningful way, that there is a level of competitive intensity within the sector that enables FDI to play its role, is very, very important. And so we find that when people talk about FDI and why it's important to attract FDI into developing countries, they focus on it's contributing capital. Yes, it's doing that. It's contributing technology. Yes, it's doing that. It's contributing managerial know-how. Those are all very important. But just as importantly, and in many cases more importantly, it's that they infuse a level of competitive dynamic that did not exist in that sector before. So let me, before I jump to the next one, let me give you a very clear example of that. India automotive. We had...
So just to go back to the slide, have you considered factors such as like political risk? I know in some countries, I mean I come from Bolivia, so I mean I think it's tied a little bit to macroeconomic instability, but or stability, but it also has to do with the risk of like changing government and changing laws or contracts or ways like that. So how much does that? Absolutely.
I think when we describe a macroeconomic environment, we don't mean it narrowly in the sense of stable inflation or exchange rates. We mean more broadly an environment in which those risks are mitigated. But let me come back to this question of the importance of a competitive environment, not just the direct inflow of capital, technology, and know-how. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll give you the top line. This is the case of India automotive. In 1995, you saw a new wave of FDI enter as a result of liberalization. And not surprisingly, you saw a very dramatic increase in productivity. So you look at the benchmark in the early 90s at 100. By the end of the decade, productivity had increased by a factor of 3.5 times. Very significant productivity improvement over a relatively short period of time in a sector that previously had seen almost no productivity improvement at all. The far right, that 84, is the direct impact of FDI. So these are the OEMs that actually came in and directly contributed to the productivity in that sector. 25% of the impact. It's important. It's really part of what the story is. But that's as I said, only a piece of the story. In some cases, like this one, the more important part of the story is the way that the introduction of those best practice and know-how into the marketplace forces the other incumbents to act very, very differently. And so you see what the HM and Maruti did in response. They took their clunker, expensive, terrible cars and had to, in effect, work hard to get those customers. That was 50% of the impact, was just improvements within the existing incumbents. And where those improvements did not occur, it was literally a forcing out of those underproductive players. So in the case of PAL, who was not capable of making those improvements and responding competitively, they were forced out of the market altogether. Together, the reaction of the competition was 75% of the productivity impact. So just to make the point again, because it's so important, when people think so much about FDI and why it's important to attract it into a market, they think about the fact that it's bringing in capital, technology, and know-how. That's true, and it's important. But just as important is the way in which it changes the competitive dynamic in the sector and therefore drives a much higher level of productivity of all the players. The next less obvious thing that we found, and here Maggie's work, where's Maggie? She's here. Maggie was, we had the privilege of having Maggie at MGI, helping to do some of this work in the retail sector, is the ways in which in some economies, particularly in Latin American economies, where there's a very high degree of informality, a gray market, how that really limits the impact of FDI. And so essential is the creation of level playing field, of the enforcement of the rules, whether it's tax obligations, social obligations, otherwise, to ensure this competitive dynamic can be at play. If you look at the retail sector in Brazil, you had, after the opening up of, to FDI in that sector, a big onrush of retailers there, Carrefour, Walmart, several others coming in. And in fact, they did achieve the kind of productivity increases that one would expect. They came in, did things very differently, and achieved a 32% increase in their direct productivity. However, they are now operating with the existing tax structure and social obligations more broadly, so their net margin disappears. They have absolutely no pricing power because they're competing with large operators in the market who are basically evading taxes and therefore have that price umbrella. And that dynamic, in effect, keeps a much, much greater share of the retail market with the underproductive players who are informal, and the tax evasion gives them that sort of competitive edge. So in our view, countries that attract a lot of FDI into sectors where they don't enforce the regulations and create smaller incidents of informality do not get the FDI impact that they would seek to have. So in effect, our view is that across all these cases, we see pretty dramatic positive impact. We think there's opportunity for greater positive impact if people understand the dynamic of foreign direct investment is not narrowly its transference of capital and knowledge, but certainly the competitive dynamic it contributes to. But it's likely to continue pretty aggressively as we go forward, given how big the value creation opportunities are for the companies involved. So let me pause there and just open it up for discussion. Happy to talk about more of this case studies or just a more general discussion.
For any of the cases, a joint venture or acquisition into that country where they've actually upgraded existing infrastructure?
They were both. We had instances of entry and JVs. We had instances of greenfield and brownfield, as they say. The truth is we did some work to try and see whether there was some interesting pattern that emerged, whether something was greenfield or not, whether something was a JV or not. And less clear, but here are a couple of observations on it. One was that clearly when a company can come in and set up its operations from scratch, a lot easier than when they're coming in to acquire a company and try to achieve the same kind of productivity gains with a set of practices that have been embedded in the employment base and customer base and otherwise. Having said that, there are times when that falls apart. And we saw, for example, in the case of Chinese auto sector, where the JVs were actually essential for the automakers to have access to the distribution chain. And so even though they had to live, in some cases they really were greenfield operations, they just had to pay a partner some amount to operate there. But in cases where they were taking over existing operations, as painful as that may have been, it was a worthwhile cost to pay in order to have access to the distribution mechanism, which is just a very hard thing to operate on. So that's a way in which we saw certain patterns, but it was really hard to pull across and say JVs are good, bad, greenfield's better. In the case of JVs, what we did conclude was that JV requirements were in some senses not necessary, because where the JV had a real value to it, the enterers typically sought that JV on their own. They understood that in the case of the distribution story, for example, in China. Where it had no economic value or where it really was distorting, it once again contributed to either dissuading people from going in, because if they can't have majority interest, they're not interested in going in, or where they did go in distorting the kinds of outcomes in ways that I've described earlier. Yes, let me take another question since you asked one and come back to you.
Yeah, I wanted to know what the effect is of having a big market in this offshore country, right? You talk about Brazil, India, Mexico, but I'm from Chile, and actually in Chile you see a lot of these things kind of working, but you don't see all the investment in FDI, right?
I think that we didn't look at small countries, so but taking a step away from this, there's no question scale plays a huge role, particularly for market-seeking foreign direct investment. For efficiency-seeking foreign direct investment, by and large, it played less of a role, although clearly people would prefer to have operations that can serve both export and domestic markets. So there again, the large markets have an interest. I think that the one area where that is less true, and where countries like Chile and other smaller countries have been able to get a real foot in, even though their domestic markets aren't large, is in specialized services. And so the offshoring market of services, IT and business process operations, yields some really incredible places people are going. You know, people are going to Morocco. French companies are going to Morocco. You have Argentina has become a specialized area for certain kinds of operations, because in those cases what you're really serving is another outside market. So it's really export-oriented, and what you're looking for is a very specialized set of skills, ideally at a lower cost than you get them otherwise. And a lot of Eastern European countries would fit that mold. South Africa, I mean, countries that you typically wouldn't think of as attractive locations. When you're thinking about subscale skill, tapping into skills, you can do it. Now that's good, but for a country, it's not big enough to warrant a lot of excitement. Yes?
Do you find any successful ways where countries were able to find a way to protect the local industry, attract the FDI, and make a good use of the FDI with good efficiency?
Well, you know, if you're China, you can get away with it, right? Because everybody wants to go to China. So yes, you could find instances where China has maintained, you know, at least parts of the segment. If you think about the automotive sector, buses were not a segment that was open to FDI, so they maintained all that, and in fact, were able to migrate some of the displacement from cars into buses, where they attracted a lot of FDI because everybody was clamoring to get in there, and where they achieved some of the very positive impact of it. So you see, over the course of 1995 to 2002, which is where we have the best data, the productivity and output in the Chinese auto sector increased by over 30% a year. Just phenomenal, right? You had price declines of 30% when the CPI was increasing 10%. I mean, employment grew dramatically. Put aside environmental problems China's creating and otherwise, you'd call that a success story. But they did have in place some local content requirements. They did have in place JV requirements. So they kind of managed to have their cake and eat it too, because they're China and they can do that. We would argue that that as much as they had their cake and ate it too, there was a cost to that. And the cost is, like so many of these discussions about globalization and otherwise, borne by all consumers across the entire economy. And so you're trading off protection of a small number of incumbents, either the state-owned enterprises or in countries like Latin America, the oligarchies that own them, and the employment base behind those, which is significant. And there's dislocation there. It's concentrated and it's very vocal against what is in effect a much broader but much smaller impact on consumers and the process of standard of living improvement. And I think that's the story, whether you're talking about FDI or offshoring or globalization in general. Introducing this level of competitive pressure has that imbalanced dynamic, and one's very vocal and one's not particularly vocal. Yes?
It strikes me that there's a bit of misconception out there in terms of the way the term offshoring is used. Many times when people talk about offshoring, or outsourcing, they're not really talking about outsourcing. They're simply talking about a captive operation of an existing company within a third party, within a third country, as opposed to actually sending to a third party. Can you talk a little bit about the distinction between the two, and under what circumstances a company, a U.S. or European company, could create more value by simply setting up a trade arrangement with an existing outsourced partner across the country versus actually investing in their own operations instead of trying themselves?
Long topic, so let me give you a couple of observations. And we have, separately, we were asked to come and talk about FDI. We've done a lot of work on offshoring, and so I encourage all of you to go to our website and to look at our work. But let me just answer with a couple of observations. You're right that there's a lot of confusion about what is and what is not. I wish I had some of these charts with me, but there are really two dimensions of it. One is it onshore or offshore? And the other is it captive or is it outsourced, really? And so you can think about that matrix and say, for each of those, what we see is every one of those is actually growing. The one that's growing the fastest is offshore captive operations, but the offshore outsourced operations are beginning to pick up too. So you have all of those elements. Now, the second part of your question was, when does it make sense, what doesn't? Long story with lots of variations, but I think there are a couple of things to take into account. The degree to which people use offshoring as a way to just obviate what is otherwise good managerial practice of getting the most of what you have right now is higher than you would think, given how many managers come out of these great business schools. So many times what we learn is that the benchmark for savings on an offshore are being done against the way things are currently done in the developed world. Well, that yields enormous level of savings. That's very good. If you instead said, okay, before we can do that saving, let's talk about how we take what we have now and bring it to best practice relative to what exists in this country, and then talk about the savings, still significant savings, and yet certainly not quite as high, and in some cases not justified. The complication to that story is that I talked about this fourth and fifth stage. A lot of the opportunities for taking advantage of these capital labor trade-offs suggest that you won't even get those greater efficiencies if you're not in that other location. And so you might have written off, from a saving point of view, an opportunity that if you then understood the local conditions, you might. So it's a very complicated set of discussions, but I think that the first starting point for it is to recognize that there are different things we're talking about, and when you take the lowest to the highest, you sometimes get savings that tell you a different story than when you take the real apples-to-apples comparisons.
Just from a full disclosure standpoint, I've worked in the offshore BPO business for the past 3 years.
Oh, so you know what I'm talking about.
A little, somewhat, but one of the things that we would always tell customers is don't go with a captive, don't set up your own captive, because those end up over time being very slow organizations. Because
their savings benchmark is here, right? They're just looking to save relative to a developed world level. They're not looking to achieve 5% increases or 10, 15% increases on their operations. Exactly. I want to come back to you because you had a question and I didn't want to skip, and then I'll come back to you.
Oh, thank you. So I was wondering if you have seen any patterns related to like what types of foreign investment in what industries bring others that are successful. For example, is there like a starting like automotive or retail sector, and then if that deemed successful, there are more companies from similar industries or different industries that take advantage of already like the success story that has been seen.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. Do we see instances of companies replicating somebody else's success? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, replicating it and patterns in industries. Like, does it usually start with like automotive industry, for example, in Brazil, and then that brings Walmart? Or, I mean, does the success of one industry bring another industry? Are there any patterns?
I would say, with few exceptions, not. That the industry dynamics are typically established within a sector and within the companies that compete in that sector. The exception is when you see industries colliding, where you see what used to be purely telecommunications and media begin to look and feel very much like one industry, and then of course you get those. But we see relatively few instances. You can see examples of a particular technology that gets invented in one sector and then gets used for other things. But from a broad industry competitive point of view, most of that is really determined at the sector level, which is why all our work really comes in to look at these things from the sector point of view. Yes?
I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, when the proof and the methods that you have used seem pretty compelling. And let's say you're in front of a panel of Chinese government officials or Brazilian, whatever. Have you had instances where, you have the strongest pushback and legitimate kind of contrarian conclusion to what you have on the FDI? It seems like some of the punchlines were, more jobs, high productivity, growth of the market, etc. But what have been kind of the strongest criticism towards conclusions?
Well, I think that it's less criticism to these conclusions and more the political realities in which governments operate. So you think about how many things governments understand what the right answer is, and they're not in a political environment to be able to do it. So you have think about the restructuring of the state-owned enterprises. I mean, there is no Chinese bureaucrat that doesn't know that most of those enterprises are incredibly bloated, and what they really need if they wanted to achieve higher productivity and is to fire a lot of those people. Well, that's politically a very, very difficult thing to do. So I think that we get back to this discussion I teed up before about the political realities of a small and truly displaced. I mean, I don't mean in any way to minimize the dislocation and difficulty that comes to people who are faced with these difficulties, but those tend to be very concentrated and very vocal against a game that is very diluted and not vocal, doesn't have a constituency. And so you come against, time and time again, these political issues. Take, for example, local content requirements. Somebody says, well, if the automaker is going to come in here, the least we can get is a whole set of suppliers that are domestic contributing to it. Sounds logical, right? You create jobs, you do all this stuff. Unfortunately, what you do, in effect, is create a little protective barrier around them, and they deliver terrible products and high prices, and that filters all the way back in. On the other hand, you've got a very active local supplier base activating behind this. So, I think that the reality is this is where economics in its simplicity comes against the complications of politics. Yes?
Who's your audience on the MNC side for a lot of this material? And who are you informing? Exactly what decisions do you see people making because of your study?
Well, let me take a step back and try to answer that by saying this. I think we got a great introduction to MGI at the high level, but what McKinsey Global Institute is it's a little bit arm's length to what McKinsey and Company, the consulting arm, do, certainly in our voice. And what we it's funded by the partners of McKinsey. We're not commissioned by anyone to do this work. But the objective and our target audience for this is, on the one hand, regulators, to help regulators understand the ways in which policy drives better or worse economic outcomes, And I would say business leaders, to the degree that they are either statespeople and really want to understand the way of the world, or where, particularly in the case of very large multinational companies, where they understand that the dynamics of their own success is linked to underlying economic growth, for example, and some such. Now, I think this presentation, as you noted, had sort of two parts to it. One is what's happening at the company level, and then what do we understand from the regulatory point of view. To the degree that we help companies understand the world from that bird's eye view up, once we aggregate sectors, I think very good strategic managers find that very, very powerful to thinking about how much or how little they should be doing of certain things. And so we do engage very strongly with our strategy practice now to work with executives who are trying to really understand the way the world works, so to speak.
So you're really looking to influence the policy?
And decision makers, but not in the what do I do Monday morning, but more in the long-term strategic planning context or in their role as business and society. Yes? Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I think we've got the audience is probably multilateral organizations like the UN and the World Bank. I mean, the legal enforcement and strong infrastructure are obviously very important components, and I'm just wondering, what's your dialogue with them?
Yeah, no, that would clearly be one. When I say policymakers, I mean in the broadest sense. We spend a lot of time with the World Bank talking to them about what we do and working with them. So we take advantage of the things that they do. A lot of the involvement of the World Bank in this is less than the private sector angle, and so we see them as actually very complementary. Yes?
I'd be interested to hear more color about the case study that seemed to have more a mutual impact, and why you think banking has had less of an impact.
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. It's always sort of an aside, but it's a pretty interesting story. Banking. The two cases where we went in depth on banking were in Brazil and Mexico. And both of those, let me start with Mexico because it's such a radical story. In the span of about 5 years, the Mexican assets went from, I forget, under 10% foreign owned to 80% foreign owned. So clearly you had massive foreign, and all the big, you'd recognize all the names, Citibank, HSBC, Santander, all came in and really just took over the marketplace. The dynamic process that we described that would have been wonderful to have Santander do, for example, what it's done in Spain and Europe, in Brazil, didn't occur because, in effect, they came into situations that were pretty comfortable. They acquired banks that had a huge portfolio of government bonds, so they didn't actually have to scramble to get loans, and where, in effect, they settled into a now not domestic oligopoly, but into a foreign oligopoly. And banks, unfortunately, this sector, which we've looked at time and time again, lends itself more to that because of the characteristics of the industry. So it's very sticky, customer sticky. Customers just don't switch. How often do you go and check whether your bank is really giving you the best service so you can go and switch and fill out all the forms again and do that? So a bank has to really, really tick you off before you'll switch. You have an enormous amount of regulatory dynamics that cause banks to collaborate. And in effect, they're all just doing the same thing. So they have to provide a lot of information to regulators, et cetera. The result is that you have a pretty comfy environment around banks to a large degree. Now, consolidation has changed a lot in the U.S., for example, and others. But in these sector cases, we really just didn't see. We did see the infusion of capital into both markets. That was essential. We did see some productivity gains on the operations side, but because a lot of what the banks were doing was not the traditional banking, they were vehicles for the government to do other things, you just didn't have the same level of competitive dynamic. It was better in Brazil than in Mexico. But it was better in Mexico than Brazil, but it was still, in neither case was it the more impressive cases.